At long last, we have finally arrived at the conclusion of the story of Job. If you'll remember, Job had lost everything. He lost his family, his fortune, and his health. For 40 long chapters, we've listened to his less than helpful friends argue that Job must have had it coming to him because of some hidden sin in his life that he seems to stubbornly refuse to acknowledge. And Job repeatedly declaring his innocence and unable to understand why he is on the receiving end of this cruel fate which he has been forced to endure, continually cries out for God to make an appearance and give an account for the suffering in his life. Well, last week, Job got his wish. Sort of. God made an appearance all right, but things didn't go quite the way Job had hoped they would. God didn't give an explanation for Job's suffering, but instead took Job on a tour of the universe. And in that eye-opening experience, Job received the gift of perspective. On the one hand, Job learned that he and his problems were not the center of the universe after all. And in fact, he was but a speck of dust compared to all of God's creation. But on the other hand, he learned that God is not a distant and manipulative God, but rather a God who desires to be in intimate relationship with Job. Which brings us to this morning's reading. A reading which opens up with Job acknowledging, "I've been spouting off about things I can't understand, about wonders beyond my experience and my knowledge. Formerly I knew you only by word of mouth, but now I see you with my own eyes." In other words, Job had once been guilty of what so many of us are guilty of. He had just been repeating about God what he had heard others saying. But after his first-hand encounter with God, he could now speak from a personal experience. I wonder what the world would be like if we relied less on the preacher's words about God, less on best-selling Christian authors' explanation of God's will, and more on our own experience of God. I wonder if we might just come to discover a God of love in place of the God of condemnation that we may have always heard about. Because if we were all able to encounter God on a personal level, the way Job did, then there's a real good chance that instead of lashing out at our enemies, and instead of becoming embroiled in a war of words, and instead of plotting out revenge on those dirty so-and-sos who went around spreading lies about us, and instead of hanging on to our resentments the way a drowning victim hangs on to a floating log, we might find ourselves praying on behalf of the very ones who are at odds with us. Just the way Job, in this morning's reading, prayed for his friends who had spent 40 chapters wrongly accusing him of sin. And when he was able to pray for them, God restored all his fortune and then some. God gave to him a new brood of children, and Job lived happily ever after. But that's not the way it always happens, is it? As much as we all like happy endings, sometimes the person with cancer dies. And sometimes the person who has lost their job ends up homeless and living on the streets. And sometimes the earthquake victim or flood victim or hurricane victim loses everything, and life is never, ever the same again. And sometimes the refugee fleeing from violence in their homeland is turned away by other countries. And sometimes people are brutally murdered because of the color of their skin, the way they present themselves, or simply because of who and how they love. In real life, sometimes there is no happy ending. Well, as it turns out, the original story of Job may not have had such a happy ending either. Most Bible scholars think that the happy ending in which everything is restored to Job was actually tacked on later by editors who didn't like the way the story ended. They liked a happy ending as much as you and I do. So what if we read the story without the happily ever after ending? What if the story ended instead with Job in all his suffering and desperation praying for his friends who had accused him of wrongdoing? What if Job's fortunes were never restored and he died without any children to carry on the family name? Well, if nothing else, this story would affirm the words of Jesus in his Sermon on the Mount when he said that God makes the sun rise on the evil and on the good and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. In other words, no one on this earth gets special treatment or special punishment from God. And if our happy ending to Job wasn't part of the original text, would we find this story as inspiring and as hopeful as we do with Job's fortunes restored? Would we? Because you see, throughout the story, what we've been offered is that bad things may very well happen, but not as punishment to us. And we just aren't meant to understand the why for them. Like Job, we are just a speck in the grand scheme of things, but a speck that is in deep, intimate relationship with God. And regardless of the story's ending as it appears in our Bible, we all know that we don't get rewarded with heaps of blessings just because we finally come to the understanding that we are a small part of God's great plan. But when we come to understand that we are no more exempt from pain and suffering than anyone else is, and when we stop thinking that our wealth or good works will protect us from tragedy, and when we realize instead that we're all in this together, then maybe we too will find ourselves praying for each other. Maybe even praying for people who we never would have imagined we would care about. What if the story ended without the restoration of Job's fortune? And what if it ended instead with a suffering man praying for those who had wrongly accused him of sin? What would we have? Well, I'll tell you what we would have. We would have a story that sounds an awful lot like the story of Jesus, in whose story and in whose very life I find hope and inspiration, and in whom I experience redemption and salvation. Because it's in that story that I understand that I am not greater than anyone else. That in fact, I am the servant of others. It's in that story that I have come to understand that I am part of God's great and awesome universe, and that I am intimately bound up in God's love. And it's in that story that I have learned that the only way I will ever experience freedom is in loving my enemies and in praying for those who persecute me. Yes, I think Job's story is just fine, without God blessing him with twice as much as before, without a new set of offspring, and without Job living to a ripe old age. It works just fine for me. Maybe better. Fairy tales always end with the characters living happily ever after. But that's not the way life pans out. And my God is not a fairy tale God, but a living God who does not protect me with a magical force field, but neither abandons me in my suffering. May we each learn to accept life on life's terms. May we come to understand that God doesn't owe us anything. And may we each arrive at a place in life that we are able to pray for those who don't understand us, and in so doing, experience the fullness of God's grace and love and salvation. Amen.